Hey everyone, welcome back to Portal of Wisdom. I'm back today with another story for you. So if you are new to the channel, like and subscribe and click that little post notification bell so you get alerted when I post new videos. And now on to today's topic. Today we are going to talk about a lost Civil War treasure in North Carolina. So in late 1864, it became apparent to the South that they weren't going to win the war against the North. So at this point, the South was running out of money to fund the war. And though they still had quite a few $1,000,000 left in their treasury, it wasn't going to be enough due to the huge amount of funds that were needed to continue to pay their soldiers and to feed them and to arm them and to buy more weapons and horses and everything that was needed. So at this point, the leaders of the South changed their strategy. So they would back off of funding the war effort as it was no longer working in their favor, and they deemed that it would just use their whole remaining treasury up and they would have nothing left over and still lose the war. So instead, they would now sacrifice their war efforts and they would do what they could to protect the remaining few $1,000,000 that were left in the South's treasury. So, of course, only the top brass, they were aware of what this new change of events was to be. So the leaders of the South, they met in Richmond, Virginia, and they made a plan to save the treasury, or the remaining treasury. So they didn't want their hard-fought and hard-collected funds to come into the hands of the Union Army, and they wanted to make sure that it stayed in the South until after the war was over. So in one such meeting, they took a good amount of the treasury, and it was estimated to be in the millions of dollars, and it was said to be thousands of gold piece coins, and they packed them into these large cooking pots and wired the lids shut. I don't know if these were Dutch oven type of cooking pots or something similar. It sounds like they were cast iron pots, probably very similar to Dutch oven pots. And so these large cast iron kitchen pots they were said to not be unusual in any way, as to not really draw any attention to making them conspicuous or anything like that. So they were just your common large cast iron cooking pots of the day. And these leaders of the South, they would then send these pots from Virginia down south. So at this point, they sent for the captain of Company C of the 4th Mississippi Infantry named J.W. Duchase. And he was stationed in Richmond in late 1864. So the captain, he was woken up in the middle of the night and he was told to report immediately to headquarters for secret orders. So as he entered the headquarters, he found his leaders were rapidly making preparations to abandon the area. And Duchase was told that it was his responsibility to move a significant portion of the South's gold and transport it to predetermined locations in North Carolina. So this meeting happened around 2 or 3 in the morning. So a few hours later, about 6:30 in the morning, Duchase and his whole company reported to the train station as requested. So they were to each have 3 days of rations, 40 rounds of ammunition, and their full marching gear. So Duchase and nearly 80 men assembled at the train platform at the train station. And a train was waiting for them at the station, and it consisted of an engine, 3 flat cars, and 4 box cars. So the box cars were loaded with ammunition, cannons, rifles, and various other supplies. The flat cars carried a large cannon. I believe the last car was a flat car with a large cannon, and then 2 of the flat cars were mostly loaded with large iron cooking pots, each filled with gold coins and having their lids tightly wired shut and wired into place. So as his men loaded into the cars of these trains and on the flat cars and in the box cars and everything, Duchase was given some orders by his higher-ups, but he was instructed to not open the envelope with the orders until he reached the destination of Greensboro, North Carolina the next day. So that's apparently where the train was going. Richmond, Virginia to Greensboro, North Carolina, and then at that point, once they arrived in Greensboro, he was to open his orders. So late the next afternoon, they arrived in Greensboro, and Duchase opened the envelope, and the orders read as follows. You are to proceed to the following night to McLeansville by way of North Carolina Railroad. After leaving McLeansville, you will bury these pots in groups of 3 on each side of the railroad tracks and not over 100 paces from the right-of-way. In case there are houses nearby, proceed further. Also, plot the burial places as nearly as possible. So that's what the orders said that he was given. So Duchase followed the orders and he proceeded through the sparsely populated countryside. And it sounds like, I don't know if it was the same train or if these pots were offloaded onto another train, but anyhow, it might have been the exact same train, but they went ahead and they started along the train tracks and they started burying these pots full of gold coins. They started burying them 3 at a time within 100 paces of the railroad right away. And they did this from McLeansville, North Carolina to the town of Company Shops. And that town is now named Burlington, North Carolina. So it was a 16-mile stretch that they buried many groups of 3 cast iron pots each in each group. So once done and in the town of Company Shops, the train was then turned around and it returned to Greensboro with the men aboard. So there they all hopped on a different train and they headed for Richmond so Duchase could pass along details to his higher-ups of, the details and the locations of the buried cache that they had just buried, and he could report that the mission was completed. But during this trip on the train from North Carolina up towards Richmond, Virginia, Union forces had managed to derail the train, and a small battle ensued where the remaining Southern soldiers were captured, and only Duchase and one of his lieutenants were able to escape unnoticed. But during their escape, Duchase lost the document showing the location of all the buried treasures. So Duchase and his lieutenant, they evaded capture in the woods for a few weeks, and they managed to forage for food, steal some food, or beg for food, and eventually the men were found a few weeks later by Union forces while hiding in the woods, and then they were sent to a prison camp where they would remain until the end of the war. Of course, we know the war ended in April of 1865, so it wasn't too much longer that they were most likely at this prison camp. So once the war ended and the South was in shambles, many of the Southerners left the South and headed west to try their luck in mining ventures and other prospects, and Duchase was one of them. He ended up in Mexico, and he was involved there in copper mining and real estate ventures. And this time luck happened to be on his side, and he became very wealthy and very well off, and he got married to a Mexican woman down there, and he raised a family in Mexico, and time was never really right for him to return to North Carolina, and as he became very prosperous himself, he had no real reason or need to return that far to look for these buried treasures. So Duchesse, he had many journals that he had written about his time in the Civil War days as a captain, and the journals did include details that he remembered about burying those pots of gold in North Carolina. And in the 1890s, Duchesse happened to meet a Greensboro, North Carolina man named P.H. Black, who happened to be traveling in Mexico at the time. And when P.H. Black returned to North Carolina, he had Duchesse's journals with him. So around 1900, Duchesse died. So he had never made it back to North Carolina, and P.H. Black, he died in the 1930s. Many of his relatives knew that he had had Duchesse's journals, and they knew of the story, but the journals were not found among his belongings by relatives going through his belongings after his death. And it was not known if Black had ever went looking for the lost pots of gold. And if he did go looking for them, it appears that he never found them, as it was said that he did not die with any wealth. So Burlington, North Carolina, it eventually evolved into more of an industrial hub, and many cotton and corn farms popped up along the old North Carolina Railroad tracks. And during the spring of 1910, an African-American farmhand, he was plowing a cornfield just 3 miles west of Burlington. And it was a hot day, and he was plowing, and it was slow going, and the horse-drawn plow was moving along pretty slowly when the plow struck something very hard, and it broke the point on the plow. So upon further investigation, this farmhand dug into the ground, and he pulled to the surface a heavily rusted kitchen pot. And when he opened the lid, once he unwired it, he discovered it was full of $20 gold pieces. Now, the farmhand was not aware of what they were, and I don't know if this is because these would be gold pieces from the 1850s or 60s, if they didn't look familiar or whatever, but this farmhand, he was not aware exactly what they were, and he put a few in his pocket. And the next day when he was in town, he traded some of these $20 gold coins for dimes. And word spread around town of an African-American man with all these $20 gold pieces, and the townsfolks, they wanted to know where he got them. So the man was eventually located on this corn farm. And by the time the landowner was out in the field with this man, they had found 2 more cast iron kitchen pots loaded full of Civil War era $20 gold pieces. So many local residents were also around for the find and were looking around and digging, but they had no more luck. So the landowner was now a very rich man, and it was known that hundreds of pots were buried, and believed that some could have been found through the years. But it's possible that if people did find some, that the finders may have kept things secret, but it's believed that there are quite possibly very many more still out there and waiting to be found. So there was a treasure hunter that claimed that he found 6 of the pots of gold in the 1990s. And then he continued to look for many years, and he said around 2000 or 2001, he found 6 more. And he passed away shortly after that, but he left a good inheritance behind. So it appears that there could be more of them out there, possibly very close to the old North Carolina Railroad right-of-way between McLeansville and Burlington, North Carolina. It is possible, if they are out there, and if they are not on the railroad right-of-way, they could very easily be on private property. So if someone were to go look for them, they would definitely want to get permission from the landowners. But it appears that as many pots that were buried. There very well could be some more of them out there. And that is the story of the Civil War pots of gold.